A hotel billionaire is standing in his own lobby, dressed like nobody important, when he watches two guests tear apart a 12-year-old girl for wearing shoes held together with tape. He has no idea the girl is his daughter. He has no idea he's about to spend the next 6 months finding out just how much he missed. The rain had been coming down over Atlanta since noon, the kind of steady October rain that turns the whole city gray and makes every lobby in town smell like wet umbrellas. And Grace Doss sat cross-legged on the marble floor behind a velvet rope stanchion in the corner of the Ashworth Grand, working on a cardboard model of a bridge with the kind of total concentration only an 11-year-old can bring to something nobody asked her to build. Her backpack sat open beside her. Homework abandoned 20 minutes ago in favor of measuring, cutting, and taping little triangular supports out of a cereal box she'd saved for exactly this purpose. She liked the way triangles held weight better than squares. She'd read that in a library book about engineering the summer before, and she'd never quite stopped thinking about it since, sketching bridges and towers in the margins of her math homework until her teacher started collecting them instead of grading them. Her mother, Emily Doss, worked 2 floors up, running the housekeeping department for a hotel that was about to reopen after an 18-month renovation. The kind of renovation that came with marble floors so new they still smelled faintly of sealant, and a general manager who checked the budget the way other men checked their pulse. Emily didn't have anyone to watch Grace after school most days, not since her own mother had passed 3 years back. And the after-school program at Grace's school had cut its hours to save money, so on the days Emily's shift ran past 5, Grace did her homework in the corner of the lobby, where the assistant manager let her sit, quiet as a shadow, staying out of the way of the guests who came and went in coats that cost more than Emily made in a month. It had become its own small routine, the same corner, the same velvet rope, the same nod from the bellman named Curtis, who always slipped her a packet of crackers from the staff break room around 4:30, like clockwork, without ever making a thing of it. It wasn't supposed to be a problem. Grace was good at being quiet. She'd had a lot of practice, ever since kindergarten, when she'd first noticed the particular way other kids' mothers looked at her own mother's uniform in the school pickup line, and had decided somewhere in that small 5-year-old brain that the safest thing to be in this world was unnoticed. The 2 women came in out of the rain a little after 4, shaking water off a pair of umbrellas that some bellman would have to mop up after, laughing about something that had happened at lunch, their voices pitched loud in that particular way. People's voices get loud when they've never once had to worry about being overheard by someone who mattered less than they did. Vivian Wexler was the general manager's wife, and she moved through the lobby of her husband's hotel like she'd built it with her own 2 hands, though the truth was she'd never lifted anything heavier than a champagne flute in her life. Her friend Camille Doyle trailed a step behind her, already scanning the lobby for something to comment on, the way some people scan a room for compliments to hand out, and others scan it for reasons to feel superior. Camille's gaze landed on Grace first, on the cardboard, the tape, the backpack spilling its contents across a corner of the pristine new floor, and then, inevitably, on the girl's shoes, a pair of sneakers with a strip of silver duct tape wrapped around the toe of the left one, where the sole had started to peel away 3 weeks ago, and Emily hadn't yet found the $60 for a new pair, not with the car repair bill still sitting unpaid on the kitchen counter and the electric bill due the same week. "Well, would you look at that?" Camille said, not quietly at all. "Somebody's redecorating our lobby." Vivian's laugh came easy, practiced, the kind of laugh that had never once cost her anything. "Is this a new amenity, Camille? Complimentary craft time for the Helps children?" She stepped closer, tilting her head at Grace the way you'd study something in a display case. Close enough now that Grace could smell her perfume, something expensive and floral and completely wrong for the moment. "Sweetheart, does your mother work here? Housekeeping, I'm guessing, judging by the—" Her eyes flicked down and up again, cataloguing everything. The tape on the shoe, the fraying hem of a hand-me-down cardigan, the chipped polish on 2 small fingernails. Judging by the whole picture. Grace's hands went still on the cardboard bridge. She didn't look up. She'd learned a long time ago that looking up only gave people a better target. "I asked you a question," Vivian said, her voice sweetening into something worse than the sneer had been. "Yes, ma'am," Grace said quietly, so quietly it barely carried past her own knees. "My mum works housekeeping." "How precious." Camille pressed a manicured hand to her chest, feigning something like sympathy that didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. "And they just let you sit out here in the lobby all day, in front of paying guests? I'd think a hotel this expensive could at least find a supply closet to keep the children in, or a break room, somewhere appropriate." Vivian laughed again, sharper this time, and a man passing near the concierge desk glanced over, then quickly looked away. The way people do when they've decided a situation isn't theirs to interrupt, tucking his phone a little tighter under his arm and walking a little faster toward the elevators. "Honestly, Camille, I don't blame the girl. I blame the mother. If you can't afford a sitter, you shouldn't be bringing your problems to work with you. Some people simply don't understand what it means to keep up appearances." She looked back down at Grace, at the tape on her shoe, and something in her face went from cruel to almost gleeful, delighted with her own wit. "That's certainly one way to fix a shoe, I suppose. Very resourceful. I'm sure your mother's very proud of that little repair job." Grace's chin dropped another inch. Her fingers found the edge of the cardboard bridge and pressed into it hard enough to leave a crease, hard enough that one of the triangular trusses she'd spent 20 minutes measuring buckled slightly under her thumb, and she felt something hot and humiliating rise up behind her eyes that she refused, absolutely refused, to let fall in front of these two women. "We're not bothering anybody," Grace managed, barely above a whisper, the words costing her more courage than either woman would ever understand. "Oh, sweetheart, you're not bothering us," Vivian said, in the tone of someone delivering the cruelest line of the whole exchange with the gentlest possible face. "We just think it's a shame nobody taught you that some places aren't really for people like you." Standing at the far end of the lobby, half hidden behind a stone pillar near the unfinished lounge bar, a man in a plain grey raincoat and a baseball cap lowered his tablet and stopped pretending to review the punch list of finishing touches the design team had sent him that morning. Daniel Ashworth had walked into his own hotel 40 minutes earlier, the way he walked into every property, before a grand reopening, unannounced, unrecognized, dressed down enough that nobody working the front desk gave him a second look. He liked seeing a building the way a guest would see it, not the way a general manager would stage it for him. He'd learned that lesson the hard way years ago, back when his family had owned a furniture company in Ohio that made beautiful showroom pieces and terrible actual furniture. And nobody had bothered to tell his father the truth until the truth had already bankrupted them. Daniel had built Ashworth Hospitality on the specific, stubborn belief that if you wanted to know what was really happening in a building, you had to be willing to stand in the corner of it and watch unnoticed, for as long as it took, the same way he'd once had to learn, at 19, exactly how little the world cared about a family that had lost everything overnight. He was not prepared for what he was watching now. He'd heard cruelty dressed up as concern before, investors who called layoffs restructuring, board members who called ruthlessness discipline. But there was something about hearing it aimed at a child, in his own lobby, over a piece of tape on a shoe, that made his jaw tighten in a way it hadn't in years. He thought unbidden of every threadbare winter of his own childhood after the bankruptcy, the years his mother had stretched a single roast across 4 dinners and told him not to mention it at school, the way his own classmates had once laughed at the coat he'd worn 3 winters running because there hadn't been money for a new one. He thought about how nobody had ever stepped in for him back then either, and how that particular kind of silence from the adults around you taught a child something that took decades to unlearn, if it ever fully came undone at all. He crossed the lobby before he'd fully decided to. "Is there a problem here?" Daniel asked, and though his voice was quiet, it carried the particular weight of a man used to being listened to, even in a raincoat, even in a baseball cap that had seen better decades. Vivian turned, already annoyed at the interruption, and looked him up and down with the same efficient cruelty she'd just aimed at Grace, deciding in half a second that his damp raincoat and unshaven jaw made him someone safe to dismiss. "This doesn't concern you." "It does, actually." Daniel crouched down, not toward the women but toward the girl, meeting her eyes at her level the way you'd approach something you didn't want to startle. "That's a beautiful bridge," he said, nodding at the cardboard structure, careful not to touch it without asking first. "Triangles for the trusses. Smart. You know why that works?" Grace blinked up at him, wary, unsure whether this was another kind of trap dressed up as kindness. "Triangles don't bend," she said carefully, testing the words. "Squares do." "That's exactly right." He smiled, and something in his chest ached at the way she still flinched slightly, bracing for the smile to turn into something else, the way every kind adult in her life had probably, at some point, turned out to want something. "You built that yourself?" She nodded, and something in her shoulders loosened by half an inch when he didn't say anything else about the shoes, didn't glance at them at all, kept his eyes right where they belonged, on her work. "You're an engineer," Daniel said, and stood back up. And when he looked at Vivian and Camille this time, the warmth was entirely gone from his face, replaced by something flat and immovable. "I think you two should head up to your room." "Excuse me?" Vivian's voice climbed half an octave, incredulous that anyone in this hotel would dare speak to her that way. "Do you have any idea who my husband is? He's the general manager of this entire property, and I could have you removed from this lobby in about 90 seconds. "I know exactly who your husband is," Daniel said. "And I'd think very carefully about what you say next, because I promise you it's going to matter a great deal more than you think it does right now." Something about the flat certainty in his voice made Camille grab Vivian's arm and start steering her toward the elevators, muttering about the staff having no idea how to handle a simple noise complaint, and Vivian let herself be pulled, shooting one last venomous look back at Grace before the elevator doors closed between them, a look that Grace had already learned to absorb and file away without letting it show on her face. Daniel didn't say anything else about it. He simply crouched back down beside Grace, picked up a stray piece of cardboard that had drifted across the marble, and handed it back to her. "For the next truss," he said, "you're going to want a diagonal brace right about there, or the whole span's going to twist under load once you add the road deck." Grace looked at him for a long moment, the way children look at adults when they're deciding whether the kindness is real or just another performance that ends the moment it stops being convenient. Then, slowly, she reached out and took the cardboard. "Thanks," she said, and something about the plainness of the word, offered without any performance of gratitude, told him more about her than an hour of conversation might have. He didn't tell her who he was. He didn't tell her he owned the building she was sitting in, or that the woman who'd just humiliated her was married to the man running it, or that something about the particular shade of her eyes, a pale, unusual violet blue he hadn't seen on another human being since his own mother had passed away 11 years ago, had lodged itself somewhere behind his ribs and refused to let go for the rest of the afternoon. Following him all the way through the finishing walk-through and into the car on the ride back to his apartment, where he found himself thinking about it again at midnight, unable to say exactly why. He just told the concierge, quietly, on his way out, to make sure that little girl and her mother had a warm meal from the kitchen whenever they needed one, no questions asked, billed to his own account, and to never let anyone speak to either of them like that again inside his walls. Then he sat in his car in the parking garage for 11 minutes before he could make himself start the engine, turning something over in his mind that he didn't yet have words for. Preston Wexler's office sat behind an unmarked door off the mezzanine, a corner suite with a view of the parking garage that he'd never once complained about because complaining drew attention, and attention was the last thing Preston Wexler wanted these days. He'd been general manager of the Ashworth Grand for 6 years, long enough to know exactly how much slack a well-run property earned him, and exactly how thin that slack had gotten over the last 18 months of renovation chaos, invoice backlogs, and a corporate accounting system that was, for now, still catching up on itself. For 2 of those years, Preston had been quietly skimming. Nothing dramatic, or so he told himself late at night when the guilt got loud. Inflated vendor contracts with a linen supplier he happened to co-own through his brother-in-law, padded maintenance invoices for work that was only half completed, a housekeeping supply budget that had crept up nearly 40% without anyone in corporate asking why, buried under enough renovation noise that it had simply blended into the general chaos of a building being rebuilt around its own guests. It had felt for a long time like a victimless kind of theft, a rounding error in a company that made more money in a week than Preston would see in 10 years of honest salary. He had 2 daughters in private school and a mortgage that had crept far past what his salary alone could carry, and somewhere in the last 2 years, the math of his own life had simply stopped adding up without help, and he'd decided, quietly, that the help could come from somewhere nobody would ever notice. Somebody had noticed. Ashworth Hospitality had just hired a new external auditing firm for the grand reopening, standard procedure before any major property launch, 3 accountants with laptops and a company-wide login that could pull every invoice back 4 years. And Preston Wexler had spent the last 3 weeks watching that audit creep closer to his desk, like water rising under a door. He'd started sleeping badly. He'd started snapping at his staff over nothing, at Emily Doss over a linen order that had come in a day late, at his own wife over dinner, until Vivian had started asking, more than once, what exactly was eating at him, and he hadn't had an answer that wasn't a lie. He needed the numbers to make sense before Daniel Ashworth's people started asking questions. And the fastest way to make 2 years of quietly missing money make sense, Preston had decided, sitting alone in his office at 11 o'clock one night with a bottle of bourbon and a guest ledger open in front of him, was to make sure somebody else took the blame for at least part of it. Emily Doss ran housekeeping. Emily Doss had access to every guest room in the building, including, on the 3rd Tuesday of every month, the presidential suite, where a very wealthy, very frequent guest named Mrs. Calloway kept a rotating collection of jewelry in the in-room safe and occasionally carelessly left pieces sitting out on the vanity while she went down to the spa. Emily Doss was a single mother with no family connections in this city, no lawyer on retainer, no husband to make phone calls on her behalf, and Preston had checked her file twice to be sure, scrolling through 6 years of spotless performance reviews with a growing sour feeling in his stomach. An employment record so clean it would look to anyone reviewing it after the fact exactly like the kind of quiet, trusted employee who'd finally cracked under financial pressure and helped herself to something she thought nobody would miss. It was, he told himself, almost believable. That was the worst part. It would be almost easy. He didn't like it. He told himself that twice out loud, alone in his office, the words sounding hollow even to him the second time. He didn't like it, but he liked prison less, and he liked the idea of his own daughters growing up with a father in one even less than that. And somewhere in that math he'd let himself forget that Grace Doss was somebody's daughter too. He started keeping a spare keycard to the housekeeping supply closet in his desk drawer, the one he'd had duplicated off the books through a maintenance contact who owed him a favor. And he started watching Emily Doss's schedule, the way a man studies a door he's already decided to walk through, circling the 3rd Tuesday of the following month on a calendar only he could see. Daniel came back to the Ashworth Grand 11 days later, this time as himself, suit security detail trailing at a respectful distance, the general manager and his senior staff lined up in the lobby to greet him the way they always did, all bright teeth and rehearsed enthusiasm. He shook Preston Wexler's hand and felt nothing but the ordinary professional nothing he felt shaking most hands, no flicker of the unease that would come later, once he understood what he was actually shaking hands with, no sense yet of the 2 calendars, his own and Preston's, that had begun unknowingly to converge on the same building at the same time. It was Marcus Yates, his head of internal operations, who mentioned the housekeeping supervisor almost in passing, halfway through a walkthrough of the newly finished East Wing, tablet in hand, ticking through a checklist of finishing touches that had nothing at all to do with what he said next. "Staff's been talking about you, by the way," Marcus said. "Some incident a week and a half ago, a couple of guests giving a little girl a hard time in the lobby. Word is you handled it personally. Housekeeping supervisor's daughter, I think, Emily Doss." Daniel stopped walking. "Doss," he repeated, and the syllable landed somewhere strange in his chest, somewhere he hadn't visited in a long time, a room he'd kept locked for over a decade without quite admitting he'd been avoiding the key. "You know her?" "No," Daniel said too quickly, and then, more slowly, "Maybe. It's not a common name." He told himself it was nothing. The way you tell yourself a lot of things are nothing, right up until the moment you can't tell yourself that anymore. But that night, back in his downtown apartment, he sat with a glass of bourbon he didn't drink and let himself think, for the first time in years, about a summer 12 years ago, on a stretch of South Carolina coastline called Saltmarsh Cove, where he'd spent 3 months with a disaster relief crew rebuilding houses after a hurricane had torn the roofs off half the town, and where he'd fallen, quietly and completely, for a hostess at the diner where the crew ate dinner every night. He let himself remember it properly for the first time in years, not just the fact of her, but the actual shape of those 3 months. Emily Doss, 19 years old, sharp-tongued, unimpressed by his family's money. The first person in his entire life who'd ever made him feel like the furniture company bankruptcy that had defined his whole adolescence wasn't the most interesting thing about him. She used to sneak him the burnt ends of the pie crust because she knew he liked them better than the filling. She taught him to skip stones off the pier behind the diner, laughing at how badly he threw for a boy who'd grown up with a lake house, and he'd carved her that ridiculous lopsided sand dollar out of a scrap of driftwood on the porch of a half-finished house because he didn't have money for anything real, and she'd told him, more than once, that she didn't want anything real anyway. He'd left Saltmarsh Cove in a hurry that August, not because he wanted to, but because his father's second business, a smaller import company he'd tried to rebuild after the furniture collapse, had gone under too, and the family home in Ohio had gone into foreclosure while Daniel was 3 states away hammering shingles onto strangers' roofs. He'd flown home to help his mother pack up the house before the bank took it, watched her fold 26 years of a marriage into cardboard boxes with a kind of quiet, dry-eyed efficiency that had frightened him more than tears would have, and in the chaos of that year, 2 moves in 4 months, a phone disconnected for non-payment, an email account tied to his father's now defunct company that simply stopped existing. He had lost every way Emily had of finding him, and every way he'd had of finding her. He'd written her 1 letter that first winter, care of the diner where she'd worked, and never heard back. He assumed, the way 22-year-olds assume things when they're too proud and too heartbroken to ask twice, that she'd simply moved on, that a summer romance with a rich boy who disappeared without an explanation wasn't worth chasing, that she'd probably laughed about it with her friends, the way people laugh about summer flings that were never going to survive the fall anyway. He had never once considered that the letter she'd sent back, the one he never got, mailed to a house that had already changed hands twice by the time it arrived, forwarded to a P.O. box his family had closed the same month, and eventually returned to a sender who'd long since stopped checking that address, had told him something that would have changed the entire shape of his life. Grace was 11 years old. Daniel did the math 3 times before he let himself believe it, sitting alone in his apartment with a glass of bourbon going warm in his hand, and by the 3rd time, his hands weren't entirely steady, and he found himself standing at his window at 2 in the morning, looking out over a city he'd built half a hotel empire in, wondering how many times he'd driven past that exact lobby without knowing what he'd already lost. He didn't rush it. That was the part that surprised even him, the discipline it took not to march back into that hotel the next morning and demand answers from a woman who had no idea he even remembered her name, let alone that he'd spent a decade quietly, uselessly grieving the shape of a life he never got to have. Instead, he went quietly, the way he'd learned to go into every property that mattered to him, unnoticed, patient, watching, gathering pieces before he let himself believe the picture they made. He found reasons to be at the Ashworth Grand 3 more times over the next 2 weeks. He sat in on a housekeeping budget review he had no real need to attend, just to hear Emily's voice across a conference table, steady and competent, defending her department's numbers against Preston Wexler's increasingly strange questions about supply closet access, without understanding yet why the questions felt strange at all. He learned without asking directly that Emily Doss had grown up in a small coastal town in South Carolina before relocating to Atlanta not long after her daughter was born, chasing a housekeeping supervisor position that had, at the time, felt like the only stable thing in a life that had otherwise fallen apart underneath her. He learned from an offhand comment by the concierge that Grace's birthday fell in early June, 9 months, almost to the week, after a hurricane relief crew had packed up and left Saltmarsh Cove for good. And on a rainy Thursday afternoon, when he found Grace back in her usual corner of the lobby, working on a new cardboard model, this time of a suspension bridge with actual working cables made of dental floss, he sat down on the low bench nearby, not too close, and asked if he could watch her work for a few minutes. She shrugged, which he'd learned by now was about as warm a welcome as Grace Doss handed out to near strangers, and kept threading floss through a hole she'd punched with a pencil tip. "You come here a lot?" she said, not quite a question. "I own the hotel," Daniel admitted, and watched her eyes widen slightly, recalibrating everything about their last conversation in half a second. "I don't usually tell people that. I like seeing places the way regular guests see them." "Is that why you were dressed like that last time?" "Exactly why." She considered this, apparently decided it checked out, and went back to her floss. "The two ladies never came back," she said after a moment. "Curtis said you had a talk with them." "I did." "Thanks," she said again, plain as before, and then, because 11-year-olds move between subjects the way water moves around rocks, she held up her wrist to check something against her model, and the cord slid, and a small hand-carved wooden charm shaped like a sand dollar caught the grey afternoon light between them. His stomach dropped straight through the marble floor. He had carved that exact charm himself, 12 summers ago, out of a scrap of driftwood, sitting on the porch of a half-rebuilt house in Saltmarsh Cove, while Emily Doss laughed at how badly he was botching the ridges, told him he had the fine motor skills of a golden retriever, and kept laughing even after he threatened to carve her name into it, crooked on purpose out of spite. He'd given it to her on the last night before he left, strung on a piece of fishing line, and told her, half joking, half not, both of them pretending the joke covered up how much he meant it, that it would bring her luck. "That's a nice bracelet," Daniel said, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it to. Grace glanced up, then down at her wrist, twisting the cord absently the way kids do with things they've worn so long they've stopped noticing them. "My mum gave it to me when I turned 7. She said somebody special made it a long time ago, but she won't tell me who." She shrugged again, but this one had a little more weight behind it than the last. "I think it might have been my dad. I don't really know anything about him. My mum doesn't like to talk about it, so I stopped asking a couple years ago." It made her sad. Daniel had to sit down properly on the bench beside her, because his legs had gone strangely unreliable, and for a long moment he couldn't make himself say anything at all. Just sat there in the grey afternoon light, while an 11-year-old girl went back to threading dental floss through a cardboard bridge, entirely unaware that she had just handed the man beside her the last piece of a puzzle that had taken him 12 years and 2 weeks to finish. He found Emily 2 days later, not by accident, standing at the far end of a service hallway on the 4th floor with an armful of fresh towels, and the moment she looked up and saw him standing there, really saw him, not the general manager's boss in an expensive suit, but the boy who used to help her close up the diner at midnight, laughing about nothing until her cheeks hurt, the boy who used to walk her home along the seawall with his hands jammed in his pockets because he was too nervous to reach for hers. The towels slipped straight out of her arms and hit the floor. "Daniel," she said, and his name in her mouth after 12 years landed like something physical. "Emily." He took a step closer, then stopped himself, giving her the space to close the distance or not, however she needed to, though every instinct in him wanted to close it himself. "I saw the bracelet. Grace's bracelet." Emily's hand went to her mouth. She didn't ask how he knew, didn't pretend not to understand, didn't reach for a single one of the deflections she'd had ready, unused, for over a decade in case this exact impossible moment ever arrived. 12 years of carrying something alone has a way of making the moment it finally gets seen feel less like a shock and more like exhaling after holding your breath for over a decade. "I wrote you," she said, her voice cracking on the second word, the whole story spilling out of her faster than she could organize it, years of rehearsal collapsing into something raw and unpracticed. "I wrote you that fall, as soon as I knew for sure. I sent it to the diner's return address because it was the only one I had. And I mailed a second one to the house in Ohio because your mother had mentioned it once, that big house with the porch you always talked about, and it came back. Both times, it just came back stamped and everything, and I didn't know what else to do, and I was 19. Daniel, I was scared out of my mind, and my own mother told me to just let it go. That chasing after a rich boy's family would only end badly for me, and eventually I stopped trying because trying hurt too much, and I had a baby coming and no time left to spend on letters nobody was answering." "I never got either one," Daniel said. "My father's company failed again that same fall. We lost the house within about 6 weeks of me getting back from Saltmarsh Cove. I lost the PO, box, the email, the number. Everything tied to that whole life just disappeared out from under me in about 4 months. And I told myself you'd moved on, because it hurt less than the alternative, because it meant it was a choice you made instead of a chance neither of us ever got. I never once let myself think. His voice broke entirely. 12 years of careful composure, finally giving out in a service hallway that smelled like fabric softener and bleach. I never once let myself think there might be a reason you stopped writing that wasn't about me not being worth chasing. Emily was crying now, openly. 12 years of a story she'd told herself so many times it had worn smooth, finally cracking open. And Daniel closed the last of the distance between them and simply held her, both of them shaking. Neither one saying anything else for a long moment, because there wasn't anything else that needed saying yet. "She's ours," Daniel said eventually. It wasn't a question. He needed to say it anyway, needed to hear the shape of it out loud, needed to feel it land somewhere real after 12 years of it living only in a wooden charm neither of them had known the other one was still carrying in one form or another. "She's ours," Emily said. He didn't get the chance to say anything else. Not that day, because that was the exact moment Marcus Yates came jogging down the hallway with his security radio crackling, telling Daniel he needed to get down to the grand ballroom immediately. The reopening gala had started 20 minutes early because half the guest list had arrived ahead of schedule, and hotel security had just detained a housekeeping employee in front of nearly 300 people after a guest's diamond bracelet turned up missing from the presidential suite, and an anonymous tip had pointed directly at her locker. Emily's face went white. "That's my locker," she said. Daniel, I didn't take anything, I swear to you. I have never once touched a guest's belongings that weren't mine to clean around." "I know," Daniel said, and something in his chest had gone cold and very, very focused, the particular stillness that came over him in boardrooms right before he ended someone's career for good. "I know you didn't. Come with me." The grand ballroom of the Ashworth Grand was lit gold for the reopening, 300 guests in evening wear circling around ice sculptures and a string quartet, waiters weaving through the crowd with trays of champagne that caught the chandelier light. And in the middle of it all, 2 hotel security guards stood on either side of a housekeeping employee. They'd pulled straight off the elevator, a diamond bracelet zipped into an evidence bag in one guard's hand. The whole scene playing out in full view of every camera phone in the room, dozens of guests already whispering behind cupped hands, a few filming outright. Vivian Wexler stood near the front of the crowd with a glass of champagne, watching with an expression that could only be described as satisfied, recognizing Emily instantly from that afternoon in the lobby and letting a small, cruel smile settle over her face, while her husband Preston hovered a few feet away, doing an excellent impression of a man horrified by an employee's betrayal, shaking his head slowly for the benefit of anyone watching. Daniel walked into that ballroom with Emily a half step behind him, and the entire room seemed to feel the temperature drop, conversations stalling out mid-sentence as 300 people turned to see what would happen next. "Let her go," Daniel said, loud enough to carry to the back wall. "Mr. Ashworth," Preston started, stepping forward with practiced concern, his voice pitched for the crowd. "We found Mrs. Calloway's bracelet in the housekeeping supply closet, in a locker assigned to a locker that hasn't had a working lock since the renovation started, which every single employee on this floor knows because you never replaced them, despite 3 separate maintenance requests sitting in the system with your name on the approval line," Daniel said. "I know, Preston, because I read the maintenance backlog on the flight in, the same way I read everything before I walk into one of my own buildings. I also spent the last 2 hours with Marcus reviewing security footage from the presidential suite hallway, and it doesn't show Emily Doss anywhere near that room in the last 5 days. It shows you. Twice. Once with a key card that shouldn't have granted you after-hours access to a guest floor at all, logged at 11:40 the night before last, and once again this morning, 40 minutes before Mrs. Calloway reported the bracelet missing." The room had gone completely, utterly silent, 300 people frozen mid-conversation with champagne glasses hanging forgotten in their hands, the string quartet trailing off one instrument at a time as the musicians noticed nobody was listening to them anymore. That's absurd, Preston said, but his voice had lost its footing entirely, and everyone in the room could hear it go, could see the sweat starting at his temples under the gold light. We also pulled the vendor contracts, Daniel continued, and now his voice wasn't loud at all, just flat and final, the voice of a man laying out a losing hand card by card. 2 years of inflated invoices, routed through a linen company owned by your brother-in-law, running about 40% above market rate on every order. Padded maintenance work orders for repairs that were never actually completed, including, ironically, the lock on that supply closet. The audit teams had the numbers since this morning, Preston. I was going to let them handle it quietly, after the gala, out of some misplaced respect for the 6 years you worked here, and the 2 daughters you've got in private school who don't deserve to watch their father get arrested on television. But you decided to frame an innocent woman in front of 300 witnesses instead, so we're doing this now, in front of the same 300 witnesses. Security moved before Daniel finished the sentence, and Preston Wexler didn't fight it. The last of the color draining from his face, as 2 guards walked him out through a side door, while Vivian stood frozen near the ice sculpture, her champagne glass tilting slowly in her hand until it slipped and shattered against the marble, the sound sharp and small under the silence that had swallowed the string quartet entirely, a silence broken only by the low murmur of 300 people beginning, all at once, to whisper to each other about what they'd just watched. Emily stood in the middle of the ballroom shaking, released from the guard's hands but not yet steady enough to move, and Daniel crossed to her without a single thought for the 300 people watching, took both her hands in his and said the only thing that mattered. "I'm sorry it took me this long to see you clearly. Both of you." It was Grace standing near the ballroom doors, where a kind bellman had walked her when the commotion started, who finally broke the silence that followed. She'd seen the whole thing, the guards, her mother's face, the strange, tall man from the lobby, who knew about triangles now standing close enough to her mother that it meant something, holding her hands in front of everyone like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Mom," she said, small and uncertain, cutting through 300 people's held breath. "Is he the one who made the bracelet?" Daniel turned, and crossing the ballroom floor toward an 11-year-old girl in a hand-me-down cardigan, felt somehow like the longest walk of his entire life and the shortest at the same time, 300 strangers watching a moment that had nothing at all to do with any of them. He crouched down in front of her the way he had the very first day, at her eye level, the $100 charm catching the ballroom light between them. "I did," he said. "A long time ago for your mom. Grace, I think I might be your dad. I didn't know you existed until about 2 weeks ago, and I am more sorry than I know how to say that it took me 11 years to find that out. There's a whole story about why, and I promise I'll tell you every bit of it, as many times as you want to hear it. But I'd like to spend the rest of your life making up for the years I missed if you'll let me." Grace looked at him for a long moment, the way she'd looked at him in the lobby weeks ago, deciding whether the kindness was real. Then she looked down at the $100 charm on her wrist, back up at his face, and something in her small, guarded shoulders finally, slowly, came undone. "Okay," she said, in a voice that was trying very hard to sound braver than it felt. "Okay. But you have to help me finish the suspension bridge. I'm stuck on the anchor points." Daniel laughed, wet and unsteady, and it was the first time in longer than he could remember that he'd laughed like that, right there in the middle of a ballroom that had, 20 minutes earlier, nearly watched Emily Doss get arrested in front of the entire city. "Deal," he said. "I happen to know a few things about anchor points." It took months, not one gala, for the rest of it to settle into something real. Preston Wexler was arrested within the week, charged with fraud and embezzlement, once the auditors finished tracing 3 years of falsified invoices, and the Ashworth Grand quietly repaid every guest affected by his scheme before the story ever reached a headline beyond a small business section item nobody outside the industry read twice. Vivian Wexler put the house on the market within the month and left Atlanta before Thanksgiving, and if anyone at the hotel missed her, they never once said so out loud. Emily didn't accept a payout, though Daniel offered one more than once. Sitting across from her at her own kitchen table with a folder of numbers, She pushed back across to him without opening it. She kept her job, kept her apartment, kept the life she'd built with her own two hands because the reparation she wanted wasn't a check. It was the 11 years of Tuesday night dinners and school pickups that couldn't be bought back no matter how large the number got, and she told him so plainly. The same way she'd told him plenty of true things 12 years earlier on a porch in Saltmarsh Cove. Daniel understood that faster than she expected him to. Maybe because he'd spent his whole adult life learning the difference between what money could fix and what it couldn't, watching his own father try to buy his way out of one collapse after another and fail every single time he showed up instead. Every week, at first from a hotel suite across town, then eventually from an apartment 4 blocks from Emily and Grace's, close enough to make it to a school science fair without missing the opening remarks. Close enough to be the one who picked Grace up on the Thursdays. Emily's shift ran long, taking the corner of the lobby that used to be hers and turning it slowly into somewhere she didn't have to sit alone anymore. He learned that Grace wanted to be an architect, not a hotelier, and he made sure she knew that was the better dream anyway, clearing out a corner of his own apartment for a real drafting table before she'd even asked for one. He learned her favorite bridge in the whole world was one she'd never actually seen except in photographs, a suspension bridge in San Francisco, and the following spring, the two of them stood underneath it together. While Emily took a photo neither of them knew she'd keep framed on her nightstand for the rest of her life. He never did fully forgive himself for the years he missed. Emily told him more than once that he didn't need to, that the letters lost to a foreclosed house and a closed P.O. box weren't a sin either of them had committed on purpose, just a cruelty that circumstance had handed them both, the same way it had handed a housekeeping supervisor's daughter a pair of shoes held together with tape, and 2 cruel women a reason to laugh at her for it. But he kept trying anyway, the way people do when they've finally understood exactly what they almost lost, showing up even on the weeks it would have been easier not to, calling even on the nights he had nothing new to say, just to hear how her day had gone. Curtis the bellman still worked the Ashworth Grand's front desk, and he liked to tell new hires, in the slow months when training took longer than it should. About the afternoon, the owner crouched down in the middle of a busy lobby to talk trusses with a kid nobody else had bothered to notice. Though even Curtis never got the whole story, never knew just how much that one conversation had ended up changing. And sometimes, on quiet Sunday afternoons, the three of them still ended up on the floor of somebody's living room, cardboard and tape and dental floss cable scattered everywhere, building something that didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to hold its own weight. That's where we'll leave this one for today. I'd love to know what you thought. Did you catch the bracelet before the reveal, or did it sneak up on you the way it snuck up on Daniel? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what you had going on while you listened. If this story got you, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Thank you so much for spending this time with me.